Humanitarian consequences are fundamental to deterrence also. And I think that creative new discussions about this could be a way forward from what has become a slightly static conversation.
That's the voice of Dr. Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer, political science professor at University of Oslo and director of the Oslo Nuclear Project. She's today's guest on Press the Button, a Plushes1 podcast dedicated to nuclear policy and national security. And now, here are your co-hosts, Tom Polina and Michelle Dover.
Thanks, Alex, and welcome back to Press the Button. Hey, Michelle, great to see you. I hope you enjoyed your extended MLK weekend.
I sure did. It was a time to slow down, reflect. I saw a lot on Twitter and other places talking about, Martin Luther King Jr.'s commitment to nuclear disarmament and his perspectives that was essential and inextricably linked to the quest for social justice and racial equality. Not in the sense that nuclear trumps all or anything in terms of how we need to think about it, but as we think about creating a more just and equitable society, that is a component of it. So it was a really timely reminder.
And great to see that, this was very timely Martin Luther King Day for raising voting rights issues. So really glad that timing all came together in such a great way. So great opportunity to get out and call for voting rights protections. But my weekend was great. It was very quiet. We put away Christmas, we like to say around here. Everything went back in, I would like to say one box, but it was actually back into many boxes, including the tree. The tree goes into a box now. I have to say it was pretty easy putting away a tree as opposed to sweeping up for it and putting it outside. So kudos to the fake tree. News updates on the Iran nuclear front. The talks continue in Vienna. They're kind of starting to feel endless now. But we're up against an end of the month deadline, as it were, and it seems that there's been some progress, but lots left to do. So stay tuned, time running out. On the Ukraine crisis, there were US, NATO, Russia talks in Europe last week. They did not seem to go that well. I don't think that surprised anyone, that nobody's minds were changed. Russia is still making demands that presumably will not be met and is still keeping 100,000 troops on the border. Meanwhile, Moscow is threatening to include possible missile deployments closer to the United States, as well as cyber attacks. So the pressure keeps going up, and it's hard to see how this ends well. And lastly, the new time on the Doomsday Clock will be revealed this Thursday by the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientists. Check it out, Thursday, 10 a.m. Eastern Time. The clock currently stands at 100 seconds to midnight. Michelle, I think we should make some predictions. And next week on this show, we will see how we did. Any thoughts on this?
This is a tough one. Initially, I thought, they're going to have to move it back at least a little bit, right? You have now President Biden in office. We were just reminded of the unpredictability and the violence around January 6th that really raised the specter that something could have happened. But then I'm starting to go through the list and I don't know how much has changed. We're closer to the brink of conflict with Russia. You were just talking about with Ukraine. China is continuing to build up its arsenal. I think they might keep it at 100 seconds. How about you?
I share your analysis, but I think they'll probably give a little credit to Biden for example, the New START treaty, starting diplomacy with Russia and possibly China. So, at least going back to talk to the Iranians, things like that. So they'll give a little time back on the clock for Biden coming in, but not too much, because I think they want to make the point that, yeah, you came in, things are somewhat better, but not as much as we think they should be, right? So I'm thinking maybe 2 minutes to midnight.
There's one other element too. We just had the huge climate change conference, and that was relatively disappointing compared to what people felt the urgency of the moment needed. So I'm going to stick with my prediction that they're going to keep it at 100 seconds. So we'll have to see.
Here we go. Michelle says, sticking with 100 seconds to midnight. I'm going with 2 minutes to midnight. Come back next week. We'll see how we did.
But going back to today's episode, On Early Warning, I sit down with Melissa Hanna, an affiliate of the Stanford Center for International Security and Cooperation, to discuss North Korea's recent testing of what it claims is a hypersonic missile.
And then Plowshares Fund President Emma Belcher sits down with Dr. Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer, a political science professor at the University of Oslo and director of the Oslo Nuclear Project, to discuss efforts to reverse nuclear programs in Iraq and Iran, US-centric biases in nuclear weapons policy, and much more. It's a great interview, so please stay with us.
And if you like what you hear, remember to hit subscribe and leave us a rating. Your feedback helps us improve the show. I know we say it every week, but we mean it every single week. And with that, let's get into today's episode. The clock is ticking.
And now, early warning, early warning, early warning, early warning. A 7-minute synopsis of this week's nuclear news.
Thanks, Dal. Today I'm joined by Melissa Hanna, an affiliate of Stanford's Center for International Security and Cooperation. Thanks so much for joining.
Thanks for having me, Michelle.
So, as you know, we have 7 minutes to cover the week's nuclear news because that's the amount of time a U.S. president would have to decide to respond to an incoming nuclear strike. So, I think we can do it in 7 minutes if they can make a decision by then. First things first. North Korea said its leader Kim Jong-un recently oversaw a successful flight test of a hypersonic missile. And the state media report came the day after the United States, South Korea, and Japan said that they detected that North Korea fired a suspected ballistic missile. What does this mean for their program?
Yeah, I think in the open source, we don't have perfect information about what was launched or when it was detected. But I think we can say, based on what we're hearing from Japan, South Korea, the US, and with a grain of salt from North Korea itself, it looks like North Korea has tested a new vehicle, which they call hypersonic, but really a better name for it would be a MARV, a maneuverable reentry vehicle missile. And essentially what that is an ICBM, a ballistic missile that takes off from the ground, and then later a reentry vehicle separates, and it can maneuver in flight, making it pretty hard for radar to track it and for missiles to intercept it. So hypersonic is the good marketing term for it. And you probably hear that the US and China and Russia are all developing hypersonics. But really the takeaway from what North Korea has built is not that it's fast. You know, an ICBM is also hypersonic. It's that it can maneuver after launch. And it makes it very confusing for people who are trying to track it and intercept it.
Do you think that this is an attempt to put pressure on the West? And if so, what do you think North Korea is hoping to achieve?
I mean, I think that the North Korea is constantly trying to put pressure on its adversaries or its perceived adversaries. And with a very small nuclear force like North Korea has, what it's trying to do is make sure that its a limited number of nuclear warheads are survivable, meaning that they can't be wiped out easily and that they get to their destination. So if their destination is mainland US or Japan or South Korea, what they really want to do is be able to overcome ballistic missile defense. And in order for them to do that, they're going to keep coming up with these tricky missiles, which can fly beneath radar or behind radar batteries, or make a maneuver after you've already calculated out the curve of where a missile is going. It's really an asymmetric fight for money, essentially, because it's much cheaper for North Korea to make a missile that is confusing than it is to install all the radar batteries, do all the tracking, and try to intercept such a missile with more than one interceptor missile, right? So for North Korea, this is a good deal because they're raising the cost on South Korea, Japan, and the United States much, much more than it costs them themselves to build this kind of missile. This particular missile has an impact on whether ballistic missile defense will be successful or not.
The Biden administration imposed its first sanctions over North Korea's weapons program following the missile test. Now, this, of course, comes on top of the sanctions that were already in place. What should the international community be doing to prevent North Korea from making further progress or conducting more tests?
No, I think if I had the answer to that, I could just retire and we could calm down and have peaceful reunification and no problem. But this is not an easy question to answer. In my personal opinion, there are standards on nonproliferation that we have to maintain, and we can never be seen to be caving to any country or ourselves. And we have to maintain that really good nonproliferation. But I don't think sanctions are going to make much more of a difference on North Korea's existing nuclear, missile, chemical, biological program. They've already shown themselves to be incredibly resilient and crafty at getting the resources they need and indigenously reproducing those things to create weapons that put us in a terrible position. And I also don't think it's a great tool for convincing North Koreans to come to the table to talk. That being said, it doesn't look like the North Koreans are coming to the table to talk. And it is a tool that still reiterates our determination in preventing the spread of weapons, whether that's horizontally to new countries or vertically within a country. And it's one that we know gets North Korea's attention. So I can see why sanctions would continue to be used, especially when there isn't a really obvious other good tool to use. The one caveat I would add is that at some point we do have to come to the table with North Korea in a way that recognizes their underlying security concerns, because we can't put this WMD genie back in the bottle. We can't unlearn that technical information, and we have to treat them, even though we don't want to, we have to treat them like a nuclear weapons state, not in the NPT sense, but in a state that possesses nuclear weapons. That's hard, I think, if I could say spiritually, because it means that nonproliferation didn't win this time.
Well, with that, our time is up. Melissa, thank you so much for joining.
Thanks for having me.
Hi, I'm Bonnie Fisk, Deputy Director of Development at Plowshares Fund and a Press the Button listener. When I first joined Plowshares Fund back in 2018, I didn't know anything about nuclear weapons. I came here with just the motivation to help create a safer world and a commitment to lifelong learning. My colleagues told me they'd teach me everything I need to know, and did they ever? Still do, actually. As I continue to grow ever more committed to Plowshares Fund and the reduction and elimination of nuclear weapons, I found that I rely on Press the Button so much. It's a resource for the latest analysis and a place where I can drop in fully, without distractions, and gain new insight into this issue I've come to know and love. I find inspiration from the weekly guests and our partners, and I know I'm a better contributor to our cause just by tuning in. Please consider supporting Plowshares Fund and helping make Press the Button possible by making a donation today. Visit plowshares.org/donate today. And thanks for listening.
Today, I'm joined by Dr. Målfrid Braut-Hegghammer, a Norwegian political science professor at the University of Oslo and director of the Oslo Nuclear Project. Målfrid has researched and published on nuclear weapons and authoritative regimes, and also closely follows the work of the nonproliferation community. Målfrid, welcome to the show.
Very happy to be here.
To start, you're working on an upcoming book, Iraqi Perspectives on the Origins of the 2003 War. You've also previously published a book, I love this title, Unclear Physics, Why Iraq and Libya Failed to Build Nuclear Weapons. That came out in 2016, and Unclear Physics is clearly a play on the word nuclear. Given your research on Iraq and weapons of mass destruction, including nuclear weapons, can you tell us a little bit about the history of the Israeli efforts to block Iraq's nuclear program?
I can say a little bit about these efforts as seen through Iraqi lenses, at least. I should also add that there's a lot of exciting new research coming out as archives in Israel and various European archives are providing new documents and new insights into both the Israeli discussions about how to handle the Iraqi nuclear program and the impact of what they ended up doing. I think one theme that comes out quite clearly is just how difficult it is to try and stop a determined country from pursuing nuclear weapons. It seems to me that what we do know about Israel's efforts to disrupt, stop, halt Iraq's nuclear weapons program shows that it's difficult to do. It takes a lot of different approaches and tools. And in a few cases, these efforts can actually dangerously backfire. I think that's part of the reason why we've seen fairly few military attacks on nuclear facilities, although states have often discussed or deliberated doing so against the Chinese nuclear program, for example. So the fact that Israel decided to strike against Iraq's nuclear reactor complex in 1981 is a rare example of a state proceeding with such a decision. So it's a fascinating case study, I think, of the various tools and instruments that can be applied, but often are actually not applied to curb nuclear proliferation. So it's a really rich case from that perspective. And also, I would like to add, we're talking about the 1970s and the early 1980s now, and clearly a lot has happened since then in terms of technology. So while some of the fundamental lessons, dilemmas are still quite similar today, there are also really important differences in terms of the precision of some of the technology that Israel and other states could now consider using.
So then, talking about today, how does this relate to what we've seen with regards to Israeli actions to prevent Iran from further developing its program?
Fundamentally, the similar dilemmas and trade-offs apply because, as I mentioned, the Iraqi example shows that it takes a lot of different tools and a lot of different attempts to try and slow what one might suspect to be a nuclear weapons program in another state. And of course, Iran and other countries saw what happened in Iraq in the 1970s and 80s and learned their lesson. So both in the Libyan nuclear weapons program many, many years ago, but also in the Iranian nuclear infrastructure, you can see quite clearly that they want to make sure it's not as vulnerable as Iraq's nuclear complex once was. So I would say that there are some important similarities and some important differences as well. And of course, Iran's nuclear capabilities are vastly more robust than Iraq's were. So I think that there are lessons on both sides, probably lessons on the Iranian side and probably also lessons on the Israeli side, and frankly, in other governments, such as the US. One lesson that I think we sort of see play out a little bit is the skepticism against military force as opposed to various other options, covert tools, and so on. And coming back to this point about how difficult it is to stop a state from pursuing and possibly acquiring nuclear weapons, it seems that disruption is as important because developing nuclear weapons takes a long time. I mean, that's one of the fascinating historical trends that we've seen in nuclear proliferation is that it seems to take longer, even though the technology is getting older in a way. And so with enough disruption, with enough unwanted international attention, it is possible that the sort of consensus in the states that might be pursuing nuclear weapons can actually weaken. So I think this disruptive effect is perhaps a very important one in current environment.
So just to clarify, are you talking here about disruptive activities as distinct from military activities? Are these different kinds of disruptive actions?
All of these actions can have disruptive effects. Some last longer than others. So the debate about whether it was a good idea to attack the Iraqi nuclear reactor in 1981 has mainly been about whether it denied Iraq a quick route to a nuclear weapons capability or whether it actually just accelerated their program and their effort to acquire these weapons. And we can have a conversation about those effects. In my research, I found that it was a mixed impact. Iraq opted for technologies that were, some easier and some more difficult for them to manage on their own. But ultimately, the program went underground and made increasingly rapid progress in the late 1980s. But in terms of the toolkit that states have to disrupt the nuclear weapons program, there are a lot of different pieces to that arsenal today. There are cyber weapons, there are sabotage efforts like assassinating scientists, bombing facilities. There are all kinds of different things that states can do to create problems, disrupt operations of facilities, but more broadly, just create unwanted attention and noise around a program. So when I say disruptive, I think that many different tools can have a disruptive effect, but they're all temporary. And looking at the delaying effects that various attacks can have, we're usually talking about months, not years.
So, Målfrid, you mentioned something about how military attacks can backfire. Can you explain a little bit more about what you mean here?
In the lead up to the Israeli attack on the Iraqi nuclear reactor complex, there was a lot of discussion, or at least some discussion, among Israeli elites about whether this was a good idea or not and what the impact could be on Iraq's nuclear program. Shimon Peres, who later became a very senior Israeli politician and actually was senior in the opposition back in 1981 when this was happening, he made the point that what is intended to prevent can become a catalyst. And I think that really captures the issue here, which was that while a military attack, of course, could make it more difficult for Iraq to develop nuclear weapons using the route that they seem to be launching, it did create more determination within the Iraqi leadership to go ahead and do this. Saddam Hussein at the time was very much concerned with the Iran-Iraq war, which wasn't going well for Iraq. And he had his mind on other matters than the nuclear program, which, after all, was quite close to his heart. But this attack was a public humiliation, and it was clear that he wanted to respond in some shape or form. And the response that came was an underground program with no limits in terms of resources and what they could ask for. And the other interesting side to this is that the reactor that was destroyed wasn't really suited for a full-on nuclear weapons program. It came from France, and the French government was really quite concerned about Iraq's nuclear intentions. And they had made a number of changes so that the reactor really wouldn't be suitable. So it doesn't seem like the Iraqi leadership was made aware of all of this. And there was a pretty furious discussion among Iraqi nuclear scientists just as this reactor was on its way to Iraq about whether it could really serve its purpose in a future nuclear weapons program. And their conclusion was that probably not. So from that perspective, when this reactor was destroyed, it sort of took the problem away and they could pursue other technologies. So in a way, it is possible that this attack actually got rid of a reactor that wasn't really suited for a nuclear weapons program and had perhaps been oversold by the Iraqi nuclear scientists to the Iraqi leadership.
And that certainly has interesting implications as we think about options that might be on the table for Iran today and weighing up which of those various options might have what kind of effect.
I agree with that. And I think that looking at some of the covert actions targeting Iranian nuclear facilities, it does seem to me that at least some of them have happened because states are really concerned about a military attack on Iranian nuclear facilities.
All right, so switching gears. In contrast to the use of force to prevent the development of nuclear programs, there are efforts in diplomacy to advance nonproliferation. One recent success in this regard is the effort by the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons, which, alongside partners globally, helped to bring about the passage of the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the TPNW, in 2017. Now, your home country, Norway, has not signed the treaty, but they are the only NATO state thus far to be attending the upcoming meeting of states parties as an observer this coming March. So tell us a little bit about this, and what do you think the goal is for Norway in joining this meeting, and what message do you think it sends?
For the new Norwegian government, a key priority is to revitalize both the non-proliferation and the disarmament efforts in the global community. It's not possible for Norway as a NATO member to sign and ratify this treaty, but this government is really committed to following this initiative alongside other existing initiatives and activities to promote disarmament. So we will probably be joined by the new German government as well as observer states. And there are, of course, many other observer states as well, including our neighbor states. I believe that for this government, it's an opportunity to follow the process and see what the next steps are, first and foremost, and also to signal concern about the state of the world when it comes to nuclear weapons, where the overall trend seems to be modernization and qualitative arms races and not disarmament and non-proliferation. There are several other priorities as well for this new government, and one is to revitalize this focus on humanitarian consequences. That's an area where Norway and other countries have previously played quite an active role, and it seems that this government is keen to pick up that work. That is something I think is quite exciting because it does hold the potential to bridge some of this rather polarized discussion we've seen between the pro-ban treaty advocates and others who are concerned with nuclear deterrence. Humanitarian consequences are fundamental to deterrence also. And I think that creative new discussions about this could be a way forward from what has become a slightly static conversation. So I look forward to seeing what the Norwegian government does. And I also look forward to seeing what the first meeting of the state party, what that leads to. I wish that we would have had the NPT meeting first, of course, but such is life. And well, I'm at least hopeful that 2022 can lead us to see some new initiatives and hopefully a little bit of progress in this area.
So taking a step back from the meeting of states parties, tell us in your mind, what has the TPNW brought up or exposed in the discourse on nuclear weapons more broadly?
I think that this initiative and the humanitarian initiative that preceded it has had an important effect in terms of how we think about nuclear weapons. I think we're all well advised to think about the damage these weapons can do. There is perhaps sometimes a temptation to think about this in abstract terms. We can't afford to do that. We have to think about what these weapons can do and the kinds of damage that they can create. And I think that this is a very important part of what this initiative has done. Another side to this, as someone who lives in a NATO member state that doesn't have its own nuclear weapons, is that within this conversation, there has been an attempt to sort of name and shame umbrella states for being part of an alliance that is a nuclear alliance. And for me, it seems that the Norwegian government's choice to observe the meeting of the state parties is important in showing that it is possible to support the intention behind this initiative while also being a NATO member state subscribing to the strategic concept, which, as we know, is now about to be updated. It is possible to do both. And I think that this is an important signal.
So you've worked to expose biases in political science, particularly the effects of US-centric nuclear policy. Tell us a bit about that and what this means in the context of global nuclear policy around the world.
Yeah, this is a topic that's near and dear to my heart and to a lot of others in our field as well. For me, it seemed, as someone who came to finish my PhD in the United States and spent a couple of years there, both as a pre-doc fellow and a postdoctoral fellow, just how US colored the lenses were on this issue and on this topic. There are so many strong communities in the US that do both academic research and and policy work in this area. And it does mean that a lot of what we know about this has come through a US perspective in one way or another. And I've seen in my own work that there is an interesting dynamic there for states such as Norway and Sweden, whose nuclear choices were very much informed by what their relationship with the United States was, that what we know about their programs was also shaped by their efforts to be a little bit discreet about some of their activities, shall we say. So a US bias is something that plays out in a lot of different ways. Something that I find really encouraging about research and policy work these days is that it does reflect that we are now in a nuclear age where there are many different nuclear weapon states, and many of them are not the United States. They have their own security challenges, face different security environments, and have different resources than the United States does. So it forces us, I think, to see the world through a lot of different perspectives. And that revitalizes discussions about deterrence, about nuclear policy, about these problems that we've been thinking about for a long time, but perhaps we need to think about them through a lot of different perspectives.
Well, that's fascinating. And thank you, Målfrid, for your insight. Appreciate it as always. And thanks so much for joining Press a Button.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thanks for listening to Press the Button. This podcast is produced and edited in Washington, D.C. by Lauren Billett and Angela Kelly, and in San Francisco by Jacqueline Shing and Delphine Vigil, with research and assistance from Alex Hall, Harry Tarpey, and Desiree Cepetis. Audio engineering and sound design by Jacqueline Shing. Our theme song is by Lyrics Born and the Poets of Rhythm, sampled with kind permission. Additional music by San Francisco-based bands 17 Evergreen and the Society of Rockets. To continue the dialogue and support our work, visit plowshares.org.